one meditates using the sixth consciousness. We are now learning about meditation, so how do we meditate? We meditate with the sixth consciousness. It is generally called mental consciousness as it deals with concepts and thoughts. It involves the past, present, and future, good and bad, various afflictions, and all kinds of concepts and thoughts. The root of all of these is mental consciousness. Hence, the sixth consciousness is the root of all thoughts and concepts. During meditation, one tries to control this consciousness that experiences all thoughts, illusions, and feelings. One holds the sixth consciousness still so that such thoughts do not arise. The sixth consciousness has two aspects: knowledge of others and knowledge of oneself. The knowledge of others occurs when the mind turns outward and thinks, this is good, or this is bad, I need this, or I don't need this. Externally orientated knowledge is conceptual. The knowledge of oneself is very direct knowledge of what one is thinking. This self-awareness is non-conceptual. It is direct perception, awareness, and experience. Without this self-awareness, one would not know what one is thinking about. In other words, you directly see what you are thinking about, without relying on inference. Inference is conceptual and discriminative. Without this self-awareness, one would not know what one is thinking about. It gives us clear knowledge of whether we are meditating or not. Therefore, in meditation, we have this mindfulness and awareness. When meditating, the mind, or the general mental consciousness, is absorbed into the ground consciousness, a layer consciousness. For example, we can see thoughts as waves and the ground consciousness as the ocean. Waves arise from the ocean and then merge back into it. In the same way, thoughts emerge from the unceasing, unimpaired clarity of the ground consciousness and then disappear into it. When it is windy, the waves in the ocean increase. When it is calm, the waves subside and the ocean becomes stable and calm. In the same way, thoughts appear in the mind, like a wind coming from the ground consciousness. This gives rise to all mental activities. When this wind from the ground consciousness subsides and merges back into itself, thoughts diminish and the mind becomes still. Milarepa, in one of his songs, described the manifestations of the mind in the same way that waves are a manifestation of the sea. Waves come to rest in the sea, just as thoughts come to rest in the mind. Thoughts are just the play or manifestation of the mind. They arise from the mind because they originate there. Hence, when the wind from the ground consciousness subsides, the mind becomes still. This is a very important insight. Please understand that thoughts originate from the deeper eighth consciousness, the ground consciousness. Since there is coming, there is going. Since they arise, they will cease. If you don't stir the wind, thoughts will naturally subside. What we need to do now is stop the wind. The wind here refers to the karmic wind. When karmic winds blow, thoughts inevitably emerge. Our task is to refrain from creating new karma. However, past habitual tendencies remain and continue to function, so we must apply antidotes. What should our sixth consciousness do now? It should strive to calm the wind. Through study, the sixth consciousness learns how to deal with this wind. When the wind blows southward, we send a wind northward to counteract it. In this way, the disturbance gradually subsides. When facing a south gale, we respond with a north gale. This is the antidote. Therefore, for novice practitioners, applying antidotes is essential. As I said yesterday, only when the wind has almost ceased but waves still surge should you refrain from adding more wind. If the wind has already stopped and you blow another gust, wouldn't the waves become even larger? In other words, when the karmic winds are no longer blowing, there is no need to apply remedies. When the wind has stopped but the waves still arise, what should we do? The waves will subside on their own. Just ignore the thoughts and be mindful of them without applying antidotes. Applying antidotes is just a way to address problems. It requires exerting mental effort, like blowing wind, to counteract disturbances. At the beginning, our self-grasping is as solid as a diamond. To counteract self-grasping, we must meditate on selflessness and earnestly remind ourselves of non-self. This is blowing the wind, right? When the wind of self blows, we respond with the wind of non-self. This is how to apply the antidote. When self-grasping is almost gone and only some deluded thoughts remain, there is no need to counteract them. They will subside on their own. Once the sense of self is extinguished, these deluded thoughts gradually fade. This is what occurs in the advanced stages. After realizing the nature of the mind, when the wind has ceased, even if waves still arise, there is no need to be concerned. The waves will calm by themselves. They are just residual habits, so don't fear them. In reality, where there are waves, there must still be some wind, though slight, because the waves themselves can stir the wind. But that is fine. At that stage, just ignore them, and they will gradually subside on their own. However, as I emphasized yesterday, we must not practice this method now. We need to apply antidotes because our self-grasping is too deeply ingrained. The wind of self-grasping is too strong. It is constantly present. Hence, we must meditate on selflessness to counteract this firm clinging. We use our sixth consciousness daily for listening to and reflecting on the Dharma. Of course, with the support of the eye consciousness and ear consciousness. The eye and ear consciousnesses serve only as supportive conditions. It is the sixth consciousness that emerges in listening, reflecting, and practicing, gradually counteracting the self-grasping of the seventh consciousness. The sixth consciousness has conceptual self-grasping. As explained in the treatise on the demonstration of consciousness only, the sixth consciousness has both conceptual and innate self-grasping, and the seventh consciousness also has both. This explanation is also valid, as phenomena are classified according to human understanding. In daily life, the conceptual self-grasping of the sixth consciousness is obvious. Upon hearing teachings on selflessness, the conceptual self-grasping may instantly fade, but the habitual tendency of self-grasping in the sixth consciousness remains. In fact, innate self-grasping is merely a habitual tendency. Even without discrimination, it still clings to the notion of self. This habitual tendency is called innate self-grasping. For conceptual self-grasping, the sense of self arises when you discriminate and subsides when you don't. So, the ultimate form of samatha is making thoughts disappear into the ground consciousness. This is the ultimate samatha. One lets deluded thoughts gradually subside, thereby stabilizing the mind. Without wisdom, practicing meditation is simply letting thoughts disappear into the ground consciousness, like waves merging into the ocean. Thus, the mind becomes very stable and relaxed. In other words, if many thoughts emerge from the ground consciousness, then during meditation, one must strive to absorb them back into the unceasing, unimpaired clarity of the ground consciousness. It means without interruption or obstruction. In this way, one will have a relaxed and still mind. The mind becomes as calm as the ocean. The sixth consciousness must relax into the ground consciousness. This means the sixth consciousness should watch the eighth consciousness, within which no thoughts arise. Since it arises from the ground consciousness, it must return to it. In meditation, one needs to make the sixth consciousness still and calm, without any thoughts arising. The ground consciousness itself does not create an obstacle to meditation. The eighth consciousness does not obstruct meditation. However, the seventh consciousness, the afflicted consciousness, is categorized by self-grasping. It is always there. While it does not hinder meditation, it does create an obstacle to liberation. The text indicates that the obstacle to meditation is the sixth consciousness. Nevertheless, as one gradually becomes accustomed to the realization of selflessness, this afflicted consciousness, the seventh consciousness, this subtle self-grasping, will gradually disappear. If the sixth mental consciousness becomes involved in the five sense consciousnesses, it becomes an obstacle to meditation. The main issue is the entanglement of the sixth consciousness with the first five consciousnesses. For example, when the eye sees something, the sixth consciousness reacts with liking or disliking. This is entanglement. As a result, one loses meditative concentration. This is the obstacle to meditation. Please bear in mind that the only obstacle to meditation is this involvement of the sixth consciousness with the first five consciousnesses. When the first five consciousnesses hear, see, or feel something, the sixth consciousness should refrain from discrimination. When the sixth consciousness remains unwavering in a state, concentration arises. When the mind rests calmly and stably in itself without engaging with sense perceptions, sense perceptions do not obstruct meditation. However, since the samsaric mind is accustomed to involvement with sensory experiences, it is better for beginners to practice in a quiet, undisturbed environment. We tend to be caught by sensations and thus develop attachment. After reaching the first dhyana, the stage of joy born from detachment, meditative bliss arises. If you cling to this bliss, you become stuck in the first dhyana and cannot progress to the second dhyana. In the second dhyana, the stage of joy born from concentration, there are also blissful sensations. If you grasp at them, you cannot advance further. Your mind, the sixth consciousness, must let go of these sensations without clinging to them. Only then can it progress to the third and fourth dhyanas. As your mind, the sixth consciousness, becomes more and more tranquil, it does not cling to any state. Primarily, there is no grasping. At that stage, anger is certainly absent. However, if you cling to sensations and discriminate them, even subtly, you lose meditative stability. After entering the first dhyana, although one still has grasping, one has attained a certain degree of stability. That is why this state is considered meditative absorption. Upon reaching the fourth dhyana, the mind becomes very pure. Yet it still has attachment. It clings to forms. Therefore, it is a concentration within the form realm. After reaching the formless realm, one may cling to the state of nothingness, which is still due to the functioning of the sixth consciousness. Hence, non-Buddhist practitioners train only the sixth consciousness. In the end, they may attain the highest meditative absorption, the state of neither perception nor non-perception. However, the self-grasping in their seventh consciousness remains unaddressed. The seventh consciousness obstructs liberation. In other words, their obstacle to liberation, self-grasping, is still active. Although their mind is still, their self-grasping remains unchanged. Self-grasping gives rise to afflictions. Although desire may temporarily subside, it doesn't mean it will never arise. After emerging from meditative absorption, greed, anger, delusion, doubt, and pride resurface due to self-grasping. Since the seeds of these afflictions are stored in the eighth consciousness, the seventh consciousness reactivates them. Hence, practicing such meditative concentration alone cannot lead to liberation from samsara. These are non-Buddhist meditations that cultivate only samatha without vipassana. After learning about vipassana, you will know how to combine samatha and vipassana. As the commentary states, subtle energy or wind, what we call chi, moves within the body. The body primarily depends on this energy. We speak of essence, energy, and spirit. Essence is a subtle substance that can transform into energy. Energy can further transform into the even subtler spirit, which is our consciousness. The function and energy of consciousness are even subtler. It is sufficient to have a basic knowledge of this. There is no need to study it in depth. Simply knowing that energy channels operate in the body and that the flow of blood is driven by energy is enough. Western medicine, in this regard, is relatively rudimentary and superficial. Generally speaking, the simplest meditation method is what I often refer to as mindful breathing. Breathing is connected to thoughts and to the sixth consciousness. When consciousness is coarse, breathing becomes heavy. During breath meditation, as breathing becomes increasingly subtle, consciousness naturally becomes more subtle. You don't need to discriminate, just be mindful of the breath. Gradually, you can enter concentration. Once the breath becomes stable and subtle, distracting thoughts naturally subside. This is the simplest, fastest, and most suitable meditation method for us, known as anapanasati, watching or counting the breath. This practice helps stabilize the sixth consciousness. When I first began learning meditation in the early 1990s, I found it engaging and interesting. While others enjoyed watching soccer or playing sports, I enjoyed meditation. It was fascinating to control the breath, making it increasingly subtle until it eventually faded. At that time, I spent my days working with the body and playing with energy, practicing meditation like Qigong, and found it captivating. There were many sensations within the body, far more interesting than watching or playing soccer. My classmates enjoyed chess, card games, drinking, and eating meat, but I preferred meditation and found it interesting. Without a teacher, I practiced on my own. Perhaps I had learned Taoism in a past life. I naturally focused on the lower or middle dantian, visualizing the breath flowing into that area like a furnace. It was a fun time. Today I've wandered off topic again. Anyway, this book gives us more perspectives and insights. Actually, I've talked about these principles before. However, the explanation here may provide you with more angles or greater clarity, such as knowing that meditation primarily involves the sixth consciousness and how to train it. During meditation, if the sixth consciousness exerts too much effort, its mindfulness becomes an obstacle to meditative absorption. Initially, when distracting thoughts are surging, you need to guide your attention with greater effort. For example, at the beginning, when wandering thoughts keep popping up, focus more firmly on the breath. By placing attention steadily on the breath, distracting thoughts are less likely to arise and interfere with mindful breathing. However, as wandering thoughts diminish, you should not continue applying intense effort. Excessive exertion leads to fatigue, and mental effort itself is a kind of delusion, not meditation. So, as distracting thoughts lessen, your effort should become lighter and more occasional. When distracting thoughts are gone, there is no need to guide your attention deliberately. Simply maintain mindfulness. Watch it naturally, without exertion. Gradually, less and less effort is required. Initially, apply intense effort. Later, use gentle effort. Finally, exert no effort at all. Just maintain mindfulness. When you first guide your attention, you may feel slight heat in the mind because you are exerting mental effort. To control the mind and prevent distracting thoughts from arising, you must direct your focus to the object. For example, when watching a stone, you must fix your gaze on it firmly. If others disturb you, your attention on the breath should be stronger to avoid distraction. Gradually, you should reduce your mental effort. You cannot keep exerting intense mental effort indefinitely. Otherwise, you will become exhausted and unable to enter meditative concentration. Hence, at the beginning, you can do some deep breathing to relax.